Imagine a nation born, not in peace, but in a storm of chaos. A country so consumed by civil war, foreign invasion, and shifting power that it changed rulers 8 times in just 1 year. This isn't a fantasy. It's the true story of Mexico, a nation that spent a century fighting for its very survival. From its bloody independence to the modern day, this is the epic history you never learned in school. In 1821, Mexico burst onto the world stage as a truly independent nation. It was finally free from over 300 years of foreign rule. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. This new adventure would plunge Mexico into a relentless crucible of civil strife, foreign invasions, brutal dictatorships, and sweeping revolutions. This is the story of a nation forged in fire, a journey of trials and triumphs that would ultimately define the Mexico we know today. The fight for independence had united 2 vastly different factions: the conservative monarchists, led by Agustín de Iturbide, and the Republican radicals, under the command of Vicente Guerrero. Together, they defeated their common enemy, Spain. But with that victory came an inevitable collision. These 2 incompatible forces couldn't coexist for long. Initially, Iturbide and the monarchists held the upper hand. In May 1822, they crowned him Emperor Agustín I of the Mexican Empire. This was a red flag for the Republicans. They and the Mexican Congress refused to tolerate an emperor. When Agustín further dissolved Congress to rule by decree in October 1822, he gave them the perfect reason for a new revolt. Guerrero led the charge, but another general, Antonio López de Santa Anna, emerged as a powerful new voice. Santa Anna rallied the Republicans, applying immense pressure that forced Agustín to resign in December 1822. The Mexican Empire was gone, replaced by the First Mexican Republic. But the ride was anything but smooth. A decade of relentless conflict had shattered Mexico's economy and its land. The new nation had no experience in governance, yet, amidst the chaos, there was reason to celebrate. A new constitution, which declared the equality of all races, was implemented in 1824. Slavery was officially abolished in 1829, but the nation remained plagued by deep-seated unrest. Power constantly swung between the centralists, who demanded a strong federal government, and the federalists, who championed greater regional authority. Standing at the heart of this storm was Santa Anna, a charismatic, intelligent man who had become a national hero with the unwavering loyalty of the army. His story was as turbulent as the nation he served. He became president in 1833, then again in 1834, 1839, 1841, 1843, 1844, 1847, and 1853. Each time, political rivals exiled him, only for him to be called back to power shortly after. Racked by this political instability, Mexico was ill-equipped to face the external threats that were gathering on its borders and within the vast imperial territories it had inherited from Spain. The Mexican territory stretched all the way to California, New Mexico, and Texas. Yet, Mexican settlement was sparse. Instead, American settlers were rapidly transforming the population of these regions, and Mexico correctly feared it was only a matter of time before they attempted to rebel. That moment arrived in Texas in 1835. Santa Anna marched north that very year to crush the Texan Revolution. He showed no mercy. After the legendary 13-day siege of the Alamo at San Antonio in February and March 1836, Santa Anna ordered the execution of every single defending soldier. But this brief, bloody taste of victory turned to ash. The Alamo became a rallying cry that hardened the Texan rebels' resolve. Just weeks later, Santa Anna was decisively defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836. Captured by Texan forces, he was forced to retreat, and Mexican control of Texas came to an end. U.S. support for Texas enraged the Mexicans, as did the formal admission of Texas as a U.S. state in 1845. Mexico saw the annexation as a virtual act of war. As both sides rushed troops to the border, Mexican soldiers opened fire on American troops who had crossed into disputed territory. The Mexican-American War had begun. The war was a catastrophe for Mexico. Small American forces easily seized New Mexico and California. Meanwhile, Santa Anna and the main Mexican army struggled to repel a U.S. invasion from the north. After a series of devastating defeats, most notably at the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, the Americans opened a second front, invading from the Gulf Coast. The Mexicans waged a losing fight as the Americans marched inland, culminating in the siege and capture of Mexico City in September 1847. Mexico had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo permanently surrendered California and New Mexico to the United States and established the modern border between the two great nations of North America. The defeat was a sobering blow to the young nation. Santa Anna was made the scapegoat and sent into yet another period of exile. Meanwhile, reformers called for radical change: a more powerful central government, a separation of church and state, and a stronger justice system. But the church and the military stood to lose everything in these reforms. They responded by inviting Santa Anna back for his final and most brutal stint in power in 1853. Santa Anna's last term was defined by a ruthless centralization of power. He expanded the army and demanded a perpetual dictatorship, a demand that pushed things too far. In late 1854, liberal reformers launched a rebellion against him, ousting him for the last time and seizing control of the government with a new, radical reforming zeal. The next few years became a period of monumental change, known as La Reforma. Under the successive liberal governments of Juan Alvarez, Ignacio Comonfort, and Benito Juárez, the last vestiges of Spanish colonialism were swept away. The power of the church and military was massively reduced. Freedom of speech and the press were protected, and church lands were redistributed. This triggered a new civil war in 1857, the Reform War, with America backing the reformers led by Juárez, and most European powers siding with the conservatives. The reformers ultimately prevailed in 1860, but their victory was short-lived. Thanks to the French, who invaded in 1862 and installed Maximilian III as emperor in Mexico City, Juárez and the Republicans continued a government in exile from the north in cities like El Paso del Norte, now Ciudad Juárez. Meanwhile, Maximilian spent 6 years ruling as a surprisingly liberal emperor, which cost him most of his conservative support. This Second Mexican Empire lasted only until 1867, when Republican rebels captured and executed Maximilian and sent the French packing from the continent. Benito Juárez returned to the presidency, ushering in a period of recovery. He modernized the economy by expanding railways, reworking tariffs, adopting the metric system, and setting up telegraph networks. He also finalized the firm separation of church and state, keeping religion out of politics. By his death in 1872, he had cemented his legacy as a national hero. In 1876, Juárez's successor was overthrown in a rebellion led by Porfirio Díaz, who installed himself as an effective dictator. The watchwords of Juárez's age had been liberty, order, and progress. But Díaz dropped it to just order and progress. A loss of liberty was the price to be paid for the latter too, Díaz argued. He surrounded himself with a circle of elite scientists, artists, and intellectuals known as the científicos, who advised him on creating what they believed would be a perfect society. Díaz's approach was pan o palo, bread or stick. Those who supported his reforms were rewarded with privileges. Intellectuals got cushy jobs in the expanding bureaucracy, while military and religious elites won favor by backing his policies. His opponents, however, faced exclusion, intimidation, arrest, and, in some cases, execution. Through this bread-and-stick approach, Diaz secured his regime for 35 long years. In some ways, his policies were a stunning success. Mexico became significantly wealthier, and hallmarks of modernity like electricity and the oil industry exploded. But this new wealth was heavily concentrated in the hands of the elite. Regular people remained mired in poverty, with few rights, long working hours, and a stagnant or declining standard of living that fueled a simmering resentment. Diaz was popular at first, but as the inequality became glaringly obvious, protest movements emerged. By 1900, radical groups like the anarchist regeneration movement of Ricardo Flores Magón agitated for resistance and the overthrow of the aging dictator. By 1908, Diaz faced a firestorm of domestic and international criticism, which led him to make vague promises about a return to democracy. Optimism was short-lived. In the lead-up to the 1910 election, it became clear that the political outsider, Francisco Madero, would defeat Diaz's chosen candidate. So, Diaz had Madero arrested. The Electoral College, controlled by Diaz, declared him president again. But Diaz did not anticipate Madero escaping jail and calling on his supporters to rise up in rebellion. In October 1910, the Mexican Revolution began. Diaz's federal armies faced off against the revolutionaries. His army was outdated, lacked morale and experience, while the revolutionaries were animated by the fire of political change. After a series of stinging defeats, Diaz's army surrendered in May 1911. Diaz himself finally resigned and fled to France. Diaz's fall, however, was only the beginning of the chaos. The next few years of Mexican politics became a bloody mess of conspiracy, short-lived governments, and civil war. Madero held the presidency for just 15 months before he was overthrown and executed by his own military commander, Victoriano Huerta. Regional rebellions immediately erupted, and the U.S. landed an occupation force at Veracruz to pressure Huerta to resign, which he did in July 1914. Unfortunately, the anti-Huerta factions immediately turned on each other, triggering a new wave of open warfare and destruction that tore Mexico apart. Despite the Civil War, by 1917, Venustiano Carranza had asserted himself as the de facto president and launched a new constitution to put his revolutionary ideals into practice. He ordered the redistribution of land from the elites, renewed restrictions on the church, established universal state-funded secular education, and protected the rights of workers through an enforced 8-hour workday. The 1917 Constitution remains in place in Mexico to this day. Alas, Carranza didn't have the same staying power. He was toppled by his former ally, Álvaro Obregón, in 1920 and killed. Obregón's presidency marked the end of the most serious fighting, but a sort of soft revolution continued as he and his successors in the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, implemented a program of reform through the 1920s and 30s. Most famously, the nationalization of Mexico's oil industry in 1938. The PRI would remain in power for many decades. After 1940, some of their policies began to moderate, and the advent of World War II opened a new chapter in Mexican history. Mexico became a vital supplier of raw materials to the United States. With global industry oriented towards war instead of trade, Mexico experienced a rapid development of its own industries to fill the void. Mexico declared war on Germany in 1942 following U-boat attacks on its ships, and sent fighter squadrons to fly missions in the Pacific theater. But aside from the deaths of 7 pilots, the effects of the war on Mexico were almost entirely positive. The industrial boom allowed Mexico to enter the post-war world with a thriving industry and a soaring population. Under the unbroken leadership of the PRI, Mexico experienced consistent economic and social advancement. Standards of living rose, voting rights were extended to women, and massive infrastructure projects, hydroelectric dams and airports, propelled Mexico into the modern age. However, the long reign of the PRI began hitting turbulence in the 1980s. Much of Mexico's prosperity rested on the profits from its nationalized oil industry and massive international loans. This left it terribly vulnerable to the 1982 oil crisis, where oil prices collapsed and Mexico struggled to cover its debts. Domestic economic problems like high inflation and unemployment shattered confidence in the PRI. For the first time, serious political opposition emerged with the Democratic Revolution Party, PRD, on the left, and the National Action Party, PN, on the right. The government was also racked by inefficiency, and nothing showed this more clearly than the Mexico City earthquake on September 19, 1985. It killed thousands and devastated the capital, but the government's response was sluggish. Emergency relief was slow, and it took years to repair damage that other countries could have repaired in a fraction of the time. By the 1990s, change was no longer an option, it was a necessity. The PRI pivoted towards an aggressive free market economic strategy, most notably joining the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1992, but not everyone welcomed this shift. Most famously, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, believing the PRI had betrayed the ideals that had placed it in power back in the 1920s, declared open rebellion in Chiapas and tried to found their own independent regional government. The government launched an unpopular military campaign to shut down the rebellion, which not only failed to reassert control, but led to hundreds of civilian deaths. Further cuts to government spending were deeply unpopular, and despite the economy starting to improve by the late 1990s, the PRI's reputation could not recover. In the 2000 presidential election, the PRI's 71-year rule came to a dramatic end with the election of the right-wing PAN candidate, Vicente Fox. For most people, though, the new government didn't mean much immediate change. Mexico stepped into the new millennium with a broad continuation of the policies and problems of the previous one, as the country continued to wrestle with inflation and unemployment. If two problems define Mexico for outsiders in the 21st century, they are the cartels and immigration. Cartels had existed in Mexico for decades, but the collapse of their rivals elsewhere in Latin America in the 1990s allowed the Mexican cartels to fill the void, creating a violent and complex struggle that persists today. Then there's migration. Every year, millions of Mexicans enter the United States, legally and illegally, seeking a better life. And the Mexican border is the primary entry point for immigrants from all over Latin America. This movement has often been beneficial for Mexico, with immigrants sending money back from higher-paying jobs. However, Mexico also struggles with a brain drain, where highly skilled people are likely to leave for better work in the U.S., depriving the country of valuable human capital. But while its problems are well known, Mexico's strengths are just as apparent. As of 2025, it has the 10th largest population and 12th largest economy in the world, with most economists expecting significant growth in the coming decades. And with this optimism for the future comes a powerful pride in the past. Indigenous identification has risen from 13% in 2000 to over 19% in 2020, as more Mexicans embrace their native heritage that was once ignored. Modern archaeology continues to unravel the fascinating history of Mexico, stretching back thousands of years. The story of a nation forged in fire continues to be written every day. And with that, the epic story of Mexico's struggle for sovereignty concludes. The journey from a fledgling republic to a global power has been a turbulent one, but it's a testament to the enduring spirit of a nation forged in fire. At History Unlocked, we don't just tell history, we bring it to life through animation, making these complex stories engaging and accessible for you. Our research is grounded in the work of leading historians, ensuring our narrative is both accurate and authentic. This story was crafted using research from a variety of historical sources, which you'll see on screen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Mexico's past, please show your support by giving this video a like and subscribing to our channel, History Unlocked. Your support helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories to light. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of history is already loading.